Well, hello, my name is Heather Bruce. I'm with All Mountain Technologies, and I would like to thank everybody for attending our first webinar. And we are thrilled to see such an enthusiastic response to our cybersecurity series. And we're happy to share some insight into this really important topic. We're here today with Lauren Hextall from Blackpoint Cyber, and we are so happy to have her here to explain the ins and outs of cybersecurity and to answer any questions that any of us might have. So Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Heather. And yes, so my name is Lauren and I do work with Blackpoint Cyber. We are a cybersecurity company that works directly with All Mountain Tech. They're actually our own MSP. So we have a special relationship there. Today, as sort of an intro to a webinar series that we're going to be hosting together, I wanted to really unpack some of the overarching concepts of cybersecurity to give you guys some language and some core understanding so that this doesn't seem such a mystical space, because I think that there's a lot of feelings that this is an unapproachable topic, that it's above our heads, but it really is simple when we break it down to the defensive tactics that we use to match the tactics of our adversaries. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So for a bit of background, Blackpoint Cyber we're located in, sorry, skipped ahead there, in Maryland. That's where our security operations center lives. Step back a bit further, this is our board of directors and advisors. You'll see top left, we have John Murchison. He is our founder. And John himself actually comes from the National Security Agency. So John really has that offensive side of cybersecurity. He used to perform offensive missions for the US government. Essentially, as John phrases it, the bad guy for the right team. So a hacker himself. And really that background has really fueled the way that we approach security, because we have that real world understanding of how these hacks play out at the highest level. And we see that trickle down into enterprise business and then down to medium and small business as well. The tactics and approaches are fairly similar, and we're going to unpack those today. Now, I won't read out every other name here on the list, but I'm sure there are a few that you recognize, or at least some acronyms or company names that stand out. I'll just point out a couple. We've got General Hayden. He's the former director of the NSA and CIA. We've also got Chris Inglis. Now, he's actually a board alum. He was poached by the current sitting president to head cybersecurity for the nation. So apparently you can't do that job and sit on a private board at the same time, but you get the idea here. Now, a lot of these folks, they're involved in the highest level of cyber attacks that we see. And that really sits down to addressing who our adversaries are. Now, you've probably heard nation state actors that target governments, they target critical infrastructure of the US economy, but there's also other branches of it. And we call that organized crime or ransomware gangs. Later in the series, we're going to touch on those more specifically, but I wanted to give you some foundational language to understand the difference between those organizations, to paint a good picture of who we're facing here, so that we can then better our defenses. So when we talk nation state, these are usually espionage missions, really there to gain information, to gain either intel or patents on equipment. For example, say China. They wanted to, rather than investing the time and research into producing their own materials, say for a critical part, maybe a patent that goes for the construction of missiles, for example. Rather than creating that themselves, they might dedicate a lot of resources into targeting a US organization to steal that information themselves. Could be more effective than investing that money into creating it internally. These actors, those nation state actors, typically very slow. You hear that stat, an actor is in your environment for 90 days. That's probably true of a nation state. Now, if we flip the coin and look at the organized crime, these folks are not run by governments. These are gangs that are there for profit. They're there because there is a lot of money that can be made in cybercrime. You know it from ransoms and other forms of asking for money in return for data. Now, those go from large, complex, sophisticated gangs all the way down to the basement gangs that we hear of, someone sitting in a basement hacking on a daily basis. This range of organizations is very broad. These gangs are also operating what we call ransomware as a service. Now, you've probably heard of that, a similar term, so software as a service that's commonplace in American business. This is any sort of subscription service where we build a piece of software and sell it out to other companies to purchase. This is sort of a similar way that ransomware gangs operate. They might create their own in-house ransomware and then sell it to affiliate gangs that can then use that to target companies themselves. Now, the big difference between these two gangs or these two types of organizations, when we're talking nation state, these are really targeting based on a specific need, a specific audience looking at a particular company and a particular part of that company that they want. Now, if we're talking about organized crime, they're targeting on opportunity. What is that opportunity? That opportunity is any way that they can enter. And really, they have the ability to do these on a large scale. So they're not looking for a specific company with a specific budget and a specific ability to pay off their ransom. They're looking for any opportunity to get into the network. And that's really the difference there. Another note is that for profit-driven organized crime is really about how quickly can they get in the network, how rapidly can they target as many companies as possible. Now, it's sort of like thinking about if you're going to rob a car in a parking lot, you might have thousands of cars in that parking lot. You're not going to know which door is open, which car is unlocked, which person might have left a wallet under the seat there. But they have the ability to scan that entire parking lot or that entire internet to find out who specifically has a door open, and they're going to go directly to that source. And we'll talk more about that in the webinars to follow that will talk specifically about ransomware gangs, but I want to paint that picture as we begin. Now, the tactics between both nation state and organized crime are actually quite similar. That didn't used to be the case. Nation state used to have much more sophisticated tactics, but we're seeing as those merge, as they learn from each other, that they're both extremely, extremely well armed, very sophisticated, and very well funded. And so we have to think about similar defenses that you would see for high-level government, high-level organizations that we need to bring into our own businesses now. That's really just the landscape of the change. So those are the adversaries. Now we want to build you in some terms to help you understand how we talk about what they're doing. So I've got some definitions for you here. We're not going to make this a quiz, so don't worry, and we'll give you this recording too to reference. But these are terms that are part of our vernacular in cybersecurity, and I think help break down really what's happening. So you've probably heard of an exploit before. An exploit is a flaw in a piece of software that allows malicious code to gain access to a platform, both locally and remotely. So an exploit, a flaw in the code of software. Software is really just instructions. It tells the computer how to act, how to receive information, what to do with that. And that software is written by humans. And we all know that humans are fallible. And really, when it comes down to it, we're relying on human understanding to translate that to a computer, and the computer to translate that code, those instructions, to perform the task we give it. Now, unfortunately, those instructions can be up for interpretation. And sometimes there are flaws in the way that that's written that allow a bad actor to manipulate that. And that's really where we get to that vulnerability space and an exploit as well. So we talk about a vulnerability in a piece of software and then an exploit that allows you to take advantage of that. Because of that, that just means that there is an inherent risk in using software and living on the internet because of those just possible flaws that exist. And we make attempts to patch those as they come up, fix the problems as we learn about them. But that's a way that a bad actor can get in. That's like leaving a door unlocked in your car. We've just got to find out when that appears, stay on top of it, and make sure that we're closing and locking that door behind us. Now, persistence, this is a term that's sort of like a way back into a network. Once someone arrives in a network, they're going to use a form of persistence mechanism. That might be a scheduled task, that might be a specific tool that they put into the environment that allows them to get back in whenever they need. They vary. That's a common term you're going to hear us talk about. Lateral spread. This is really a really important part of what we do as a company. And really, it's about how these attacks play out in real time. It doesn't just happen on that first touch to a network. They have to move laterally from one computer to a next to get to the source of knowledge, the source of the data they're looking to either encrypt or exfiltrate. We'll touch on the next two a little more as we talk about ransomware gangs, but this is RAT, remote access Trojan, really remotely access a network, and APG, advanced persistent threat. This is more what we're looking at for those nation state actors. Those are the tactics that they use. So we'll touch on some of these today, but if you listen to our content, our webinars, and even the podcast that our CEO runs, these are terms that are going to come up a lot. But if you're going to remember anything from the definitions that we share, I'd want you to focus on these. And that is the two kind of branches of detections that you need to be armed with when protecting your environment. Now, there is malware, and that's malicious code. Like we said, code is just a set of instructions. It's tools that we use that, if adversaries have created these themselves, are called malware. That's the intentional development of software to perform malicious tasks for those adversaries. Now, the other side of that coin is tradecraft or behavior, malicious actions. Now, these are really an overarching category of actions. And these often are the use of tools that aren't inherently bad. They're not created for a malicious intent, so they're not malware, but they have the ability to be utilized by threat actors to take advantage of a network. Now, when we say tradecraft, this often refers to an adversary using tools that are native to the Windows systems that are maybe IT tools that we have in our environment, we use within our business just to stay operational, like an RMM tool, remote management monitoring platform. That is used by MSPs, it's used by all IT professionals in order to update your computers, to push out software updates, to troubleshoot when something goes down. Those tools can also be used by adversaries. So when we say tradecraft, we're really looking at how something is done, what the adversary is doing, not necessarily the tool set they're using. Now, tradecraft used to be something that was specifically used by nation state actors. It was more advanced. It was more specifically, curated to going undetected by traditional tools. What we're seeing now is that tradecraft is becoming much more common practice. The reason is that our standard defenses that were built to pick up that malware, that malicious code, have gotten so good that the adversaries have had to pivot, and they've had to pivot to tools and techniques that those traditional tools are not going to pick up. For example, IT tools. It's very hard to teach an AI piece of software to understand when an IT tool is being used in the way it's intended versus being used by an adversary. So keep that premise up in your mind as we go through the next few slides. The hacker's timeline. So again, this is definitely an oversimplified view of how these attacks go down, but I think it's important to discuss because, if you're anything like me, I joined this industry a few years ago and I had no idea how a network would be hacked. My assumption was if I clicked on a link, I could devastate my entire company by clicking the wrong thing. Now, that's true in a sense. It starts with a click, but there are other stages that follow that allow that adversary to complete their objective. Now you'll notice completing the objective is at step 5, and that objective could be to deploy ransomware, to exfiltrate data, to steal intellectual property. Whatever the objective is of the adversary, that doesn't really matter. It's that it appears at the end, and that there are many steps before that happens. Let's break those down. Planning. Obviously, if you're a nation state, there's going to be a lot of money that's put into that planning phase. finding out who your target is, researching that target, understanding what tool sets they're being used. There's also a little bit of planning involved if it's not a specific target. That planning might be understanding what vulnerabilities are existing today. Now, if you've got an eye on the news, you might see that constantly there's a new notification for a vulnerability that's being discovered. For those non-targeted attacks, the planning stage is scanning the internet to see where that vulnerability lies. What companies are appearing in that scan? What companies have ports open? It's not about who the company is, it's about where that vulnerability exists, where that door open is. Same thing for phishing attempts, really. They're sending out that en masse, and whoever clicks, well, that's where we're going. So once they're in the network, no matter how they get there, there's many different ways that could happen. So unfortunately, we have to have a plan for what happens next. We invest a lot of money in stopping adversaries from getting into the network. And that would be your firewall, that would be your AV, that would be using MFA, anything to harden harden your attack surface and reduce your risk. That's an effort to limit intrusion. Now, once the intrusion occurs, we have to look at what happens next. So I've compromised a machine. I've landed on a computer. I'm not sure whose it is, probably a peripheral machine. Maybe it's a receptionist's desk. There's not a lot of critical data or influence that I can do from that position. So I have to figure out who I am and where I can go. What credentials do I hold from my current position? And where do I need to move in the network in order to complete my objective? We call that the enumeration phase. And it's normally quite subtle. We see it in the testing of powers within the computer, usually things that are native to the Windows system. They're not using their malware at this point. They're just trying to feel their way out to the network to determine where I can go from this point. Now, once they've done that, they're going to attempt to move laterally. And again, that's that lateral spread. That's from this computer, I'm going to attempt to move and elevate my credentials to get further towards a space where that critical data is held. Maybe that's within the server. And that from there, I'm going to complete my objective. Now, to really be effective, you've got to catch the hacker in these early stages, before they've dropped their tool sets, before they've touched that critical data. If we can remove them at that point, you're going to be in a much better position. And that's really where we focus as a company. So when we talk about the enumeration phase and that lateral spread, that's really where we're jumping in and taking those hackers out of the network. Now, this is obviously a very big effort, very sophisticated approach to watching those movements of the hacker and being able to take that real-time response. That's necessary today. It didn't used to be. And we see that through the evolution of tools. So the evolution of security. Now, I'm sure Heather and the team at All Mountain Tech are talking to you quite regularly about things that we might need to change, things that we need to add into your security set to keep up with the growing threat. And you might say, well, Pam, you told me that the AV that I had was fine, and that might have been true. A few years ago, the AV, we used to be able to get away with just a good AV and you were set. If you could catch the viruses that are out in the internet, there wasn't really much else that you needed to look out for. That was absolutely true in the past. Fortunately, it's not today. So what we saw as the next trend was larger businesses, obviously those that had that big budget and maybe were at more risk of an attack because maybe they worked in critical infrastructure or the Department of Defense, they did government contracts, or really large businesses would turn to a SIEM tool. And we're going to unpack what that is in a minute. A SIEM tool, again, expensive and also not as fast as we'd like to be on a real-time response. Because it was so expensive to implement, we saw a lot of other companies turn to another security posture, and that was to have a good EDR and a backup system, sort of a more advanced AV, and if that fails, it's fine, we've got a backup, so we'll run with that. That, unfortunately, it doesn't cut it now anymore. And why? Because we can't just rely on our backups, because adversaries have realized that companies hold those. They weren't paying the ransom. So what did they do instead? Instead of saying, pay the ransom or give you the de-encryption key, you'll be back up and running, they say, pay the ransom, or we'll tell the world that we have your data and we'll leak that personal data publicly. So it was sort of a threat for the reputation of your business. Because that's a new tactic we're seeing, we've pivoted again. And the new sort of standard for protections you need is called MDR, and that's Managed Detection Response. We'll unpack what that is further, but really what that is doing is intercepting the adversary before they reach the data, before they have the ability to extract it and then give you a ransom for a threat for releasing it. And that's really the trend that we're seeing. Now, we as vendors have done a terrible job at giving you just a slew of acronyms that you need to work through. So one, we apologize for that. We know it's confusing, so we're going to do a little attempt to remedy that here. AV, I think we're all pretty familiar with what that is. Antivirus, the idea is that it scans the files before they're uploaded to the computer, and it'll save you from most common viruses. They work on a registry. They have a list of common bads. They look at the file coming in. It says, do we have this on our bad list? Nope. Okay, cool. It's fine to run. Now, things have changed a little bit. We needed to advance, and that's where you saw EDRs come in. They have a similar function to an AV in some regard. They do have that ability to scan the files. They do that what we call post-execution. The file comes in, suspend the execution of the file, check it, it's clear, let it run. They also have a little bit of view and behavior. They have some understanding of what's expected good, what's known bad. If they see sort of a combination of behaviors, AI is going to decide that we might need to take an action. Maybe that action is to suspend those processes, to flag an alert to a team that's managing that EDR. The key point here is it's commanded by AI, meaning we're relying on a computer to understand what's going on. And in many cases, EDRs are great. They're really good at that malware piece, that malicious code execution. The behaviors, the more sophisticated things that we put in the category of tradecraft, they're a little bit limited in that territory. And that's really just comes because we need a human really to understand human behaviors, because hackers, they are humans. They're hands on keyboards, eyes on glass, working through these attacks in many instances. AI can't always keep up with that, but they're still fantastic tools to have. They're still useful. They certainly have their place in your security stack. Now, SIEM tools, again, this was a method of sort of larger business, definitely the height of security about a decade ago. The way this works is sort of mass log ingestion. The idea is that we'll collect all of the logs from your devices, see every window event that's coming in. We're also going to ingest the firewall or other syslog sources so we can say we have all of the information, all of the history of what's happening on the network, with the premise that if we have everything, how could we miss anything? Now, the problem with that is that's a lot of data to ingest, and it's a lot to sort through. So we see SIEMs as being a really good tool to have for that forensical look back. But in terms of real-time response, it's not fast enough. It's not a method that is really going to help you in real-time response. So we're not a SIEM, but they're certainly something you're going to come up against if you're looking into security tools and trying to decipher the acronyms that exist in this wild world of cybersecurity. So good to know. And then we have MDR, Managed Detection and Response. So MDR is, depends who you ask what the definition is. So we'll level set and give you the way that we defined it. It's managed, meaning the solution is run by a team of professionals that understand the triggers within the network, understand how these adversaries work, so that they can take that offensive, defensive action. The detection, done by our own technology. That means that we can tweak it, we can adapt it as the threat evolves alongside us. And the response is active and it's real time. So when we talk about a real-time response, we're looking at a critical window of about 30 minutes to an hour. Sometime days when you're looking at that critical window to take an action in the network. We're averaging about 15 minutes to intervene in a network, to lock a computer down, to kill a malicious process, so that that threat can't progress further in that hacker's timeline. So we've gone through some tactics, we've gone through some adversary games, and we've gone through some defensive models that have developed to combat that. And that all sounds like a bit of doom and gloom, right? There's a lot we're facing. There's a lot of mystery around, what's happening and how we can possibly keep up with this. But the good news is there are models of defense. Now, obviously we can share our own here at Blackpoint, but I think it's better to turn to a framework that has been vetted. And this is actually a take on NIST, so the National Institute for Standards and Technology. We like NIST because it was created as a collaboration between industry professionals and government to give sort of an incident response plan, a way that companies can look at a framework and understand where to put their resources. You often talk here that security is about layers. You put one on top of each other, knowing that one might fail. So we have others in line to help us if that happens. I prefer to think of it more as pillars. So that there are categories where you put your investments, where you put your energy and your defenses, so that you're not putting all of your resources in one category and missing the other critical stages in that as well. So you might hear people talk about left of boom and right of boom. Left of boom is where we want to be. That is before the attack has happened. That's before anything has been actually breached in the network. Right of boom, that's that unfortunate space where we need a backup. We need a backup plan. We need an action plan to take should the terrible day happen and we experience a mass ransom event. So the way that we look at this in left of boom, the first stage is asset identification. In summary, that means know what you have to protect. Know what assets lie in the network, know what software you're using so that you can keep that up, so you can patch it when you need to. When you hear about an exploit or a vulnerability, that flaw in the software that allows an adversary in, you have the ability to identify it, know where your technology is, and have the ability to remediate that. And that's something that the All Mountain Tech team is doing constantly, looking at your environment, seeing what technology they're using to aid you, and seeing where there might be flaws in it as these get known publicly. That also kind of plays into harden. As NIST puts it, they say protect. And I think that's a really vague way of giving you instructions for what to do. So we say harden. Harden means this is reducing the attack surface. And that is things like using MFA. I know for a fact that the All Mountain Tech team is pushing for this, and we are too. Multi-factor authentication is just another way of stopping, de-risking yourself, making it a little bit harder for that adversary to get in. We also talk about operating at a space of least privileged. Does everybody in your account need to have admin credentials? They need to have the ability to make changes in the network? Probably not. These are all things that give the adversary less power should they enter the network. The next category is detect. Now, detection is really about knowing when there's a threat in the network. And that really comes back to that first principle that we went through, malware versus tradecraft. Those are two different categories within protection that you need to have your eyes on. And so the tool sets that you implement within this category need to be able to touch both or complement each other. The next, real-time response. Now, in this category, they put it as response. And we say real-time because a lot of tool sets, they'll call a response flinging you alert saying you deal with this when you've got a minute. When you come back into the office on a Monday, check out these alerts. Unfortunately, because of the speed of the adversary, an alert that you're seeing 2 days after the fact because you went away for the weekend just isn't going to cut it. So we say real-time response, working in that critical window of half an hour to an hour to a day, depending on what the attack is. And then, of course, on the right, we have recover. What are we going to do if the day comes where we experience a mass ransom event? Now, a primary part of that is insurance. We have cyber insurance because we need to protect our businesses the same way that we would to protect our home. We don't plan on a fire. We do a lot of proactive steps not to burn our house down. But the fact is that we have invested a lot of money in our homes and in our businesses. So having insurance in place, just as we would to cover our home, is incredibly critical for our businesses as well. That's our livelihood. It's our reputation. It's our well-being. So we need to wrap that last piece of risk in some insurance. Now, Blackpoint has never had a mass ransom event under our watch, and we've never had our customers need to use their cyber insurance policy. But we're never going to say that that's impossible and that they're 100% covered with us, and there's no way that nothing will ever breach us. We're not going to say that. So we really recommend insurance. And I think any company, any cyber insurance company that, not insurance, any cybersecurity company that says, no, you're fine, you'll never get breached with us, we can guarantee it, is one that you should run from. So we say insurance, definitely worth your investment. So that's really how we look at your defenses. No matter if you're using our tool sets or someone else, they should really fall within these categories. And we want you to look at your defense in terms of those core pillars, rather than saying, here's another layer. Say, does the tool that we're implementing align with a category that we're not fulfilling, or does it do it better? So this is really something I want to encourage you to think about when you're looking at how am I protecting my company, my business, my critical assets, everything that we invest, years of our life in building. We've got to have a defensive strategy for it. And that's really just the landscape we're in. So now I would and love to invite Pam to join me to debunk some myths about cybersecurity. See, we can. Pam, are you there with us? If not, I can do this myself, but we'd love to chat. So maybe Heather, you can help me out too if we don't know Pam. But one that we hear a lot, and I'm sure I know the old mountain tech hears, is I'm too small to be a target. Is that the conversation you're having with clients, Heather?
Yes,
Absolutely.
definitely.
And I think this is an absolutely fair assumption, and it used to be the case. It used to be that if you didn't hold large amounts of money within your business, you weren't transferring funds in large quantities, you didn't have that critical data, you were absolutely fine. How we interpret this is, I don't think it's going to happen to me. The truth is, you're not chosen because of your size or because of your industry. Now, there are factors where maybe medical firms are at a bit more risk because they hold so much critical data, or critical infrastructure makes you more of a target. That is true. But small businesses are often the ones that fall because they're not investing in the tool sets. They're not thinking of security as top of mind. So their reports open, there are vulnerabilities out there, there are base level security practices like just that common AV. And that makes them targets, because you're not a target of, you're a target of opportunity is really how that sits. And unfortunately, when we're talking ransoms, they're not looking at your industry size and saying, well, is this a realistic cost that they could afford to pay? That's not something that's coming into their consciousness. They're going to offer the ransom for remediation. And it's not really about who you are, it's about what tools you're using and where do you live. And unfortunately, we all live in this terrible neighborhood called the internet. And we've just got to face that reality now. Now, the next one is I can't afford it. And we see that as I don't see the value in the solution. And I think the unfortunate truth is security does become as an expense for business. And it is now a cost of doing business. It's really something like we have to pay for security systems on premise to stop us being robbed. We have to pay for security systems on the internet to stop us being robbed in a different way. Now, of course, there are levels of security that you can take. There are ones that are maybe less expensive than others. And we're not saying buy Blackpoint, you need it today, but we are saying be conscious of your security and take the steps today that you can to reduce your risk service. And that might be to speak to Heather, to speak to Pam and say, this is where I'm sitting, where are my holes? Maybe there's training that you can do with your teams on anti-phishing. Maybe you can implement MFA. Smaller efforts are still steps that you should take. And I'd encourage you to treat that as a big project that you can chip off when you're able to, at the capacity that you can. And we understand that budget's a major factor in the decisions that we take as a company, but encourage you to take it seriously and see it as an investment in yourselves. Because like I said, you pay for that insurance for your homes, you put those efforts into protecting those really tangible assets. Your company is an asset too, and that has it's worth investing in, and it's worth protecting. I'll just recover from backups. Now, we touched on this at the beginning, and that was, this really comes down to, I don't understand the risk, because that tactic of sort of saying, you know, if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to release the data to the internet. We're going to tell the world that you didn't protect your customers' data and now it's leaked on the dark web. What we call that is a tactic of double extortion, and it's a bit new. It didn't used to be such a problem. It certainly is now. So we're not saying don't have backups. I think it's a great idea too, but relying on the fact that you could just pull those back if the ransom were to happen, it's just not a realistic solution anymore. And sometimes those backups can get encrypted too, or recovering from them still means that you have downtime in the business. So we'd like to put a few stages in place before we're just falling back to pulling back those backups. Now, this last one, this is something that I really believed when I joined this business, that AV was the core solution that we needed. It was my wall from the internet to stop anything from getting to me. And that used to be true, but it's not today. And that reason is that an AV functions by scanning against that file registry to say, is that a known bad? Is that script bad? If it's not on that registry, let's let it in. Now, because threat actors have advanced their techniques and creating their own unique viruses and malware, it's not necessarily going to be on that registry. It's not necessarily going to be a tactic that an AV has the capacity to defend against. Now, a really important note I want to make here is that the AV isn't bad. We're not saying that that's not a useful tool to have and that's not a worthy investment. It certainly is. An AV is a great part of your security stack. What I'm saying here is it's not the solution for everything. So if you've got an AV in place, please don't rip it out. We really want to see you use that. But think about the larger scope, the larger picture. There are other problems that we're dealing with as well. I hope those are sort of myths and things that you've been thinking about, and I hope those are some little turns on those thought processes to think about it differently. And you know, if you have more questions about those or others, please pop them in the chat, because we'd love to hear from you. So I believe you all should have the function to pop something in the chat there. So please do. And then Heather, if you have any questions, I did think we got a couple before the webinar that we could run through as well.
We did, although you are so good, you've covered a couple already. This one was, I'm a small business in the Vail Valley and I can't imagine anybody finding me. But now we know it doesn't matter, right? It's not that you're the Vail Valley, because even though you're tucked away, you're still just as exposed.
You're on the internet. You're as close to I am here in LA amongst all of the crime and many businesses there are. It's not about your location. It's not about the scale of your business or the work that you do. Certainly, there are industries that are at more risk. For example, healthcare. Healthcare is a specific one because you hold insurance records. You know what's really great about insurance records for hackers? You don't see that bill for about 3 months, which means a hacker can get those records and they can charge up and you'll see your premium jump months down the line. So on the dark web, we see insurance records sold for about $300 and upwards versus credit card data, which is about 10. So, you know, when we're talking medical, there's certainly more risk because there's more money to be made. But there are facets like that in every kind of business. And you don't have to fall into one of those categories to be at risk. But although there are things that you'd want to know if you are in specific industries, and maybe measures that you would take that would be above and beyond what we've recommended here to de-risk yourself. But yes, it's not about size.
Another question is, what are the most common mistakes that people make that allow hackers in?
Well, I would say they fail to educate their workers or themselves, really. I think one of the problems is that, you know, we can invest a ton of money into hardening our security, but one of the weaknesses that will always exist is human error. And that's a little harder to throw money at to fix the problem. So I'd say operating without that caution and without that awareness that malintent is very prevalent on the internet and in your email inbox. So be suspicious of links that you receive, about communication that comes into your mailbox, especially if it's expressing some urgency, if it's asking you to do something quickly and passionately because they have a need, there's a problem they need to fix. Take a breath, look at that again. Do you recognize that domain? Does that email name match what's in the email address? Maybe don't send it out to the whole company to ask, should I click this? We see it all the time. I think having a little bit of skepticism when it comes to what we're seeing on the internet and what we're clicking is really important, because
I laugh because I feel like I have done that before. Like I've sent it to all the IT, and we're like, Heather, no. Don't do this.
We do phishing training at Blackpoint. What we're talking about cybersecurity all day long, but still we fail. We did a cybersecurity training, or I guess phishing training a few months back, and the test was they sent us out a link and it was like, complete this training. Now the test wasn't completing the training, it was whether you clicked on the link to start the training or not. And I think all of us failed. So we were very embarrassed about that one. Looks like we got a question in the chat too.
Oh, okay. And you know what, I'm sorry, I can't see it in mine.
Let's see. We do not have a server, we operate in the cloud. How can we ensure that other vendors are doing the same thing to protect our data? Yes. So, that is part of doing businesses. You're working with the other businesses that have access to your data, and we do have to have some assumptions that they're doing that safely. Now, working in the cloud is definitely a way to reduce some risk. We see that as meaning that if it's in the cloud, there are certain safeguards that make that data a little bit harder to access. That also creates weaknesses in other spaces. And we'll be talking about those when we do another webinar in a few weeks here that's about cloud response and protecting the cloud. So I won't dive into all of that now, but we certainly have a half hour of content we can do to talk about cloud security. But not having servers, now that's an important point too. A server is the house of that data. It's sort of the heartbeat of what happens within a business. But critical assets exist outside of those servers, even within the cloud. Business email compromise really is a very much a trend that we're seeing take a sharp tick upward, especially this year. That being that there is critical data that exists outside of the server, that exists within our cloud space, within our emails, within the exchanges that happen in that space, like rerouting inboxes, getting invoice numbers that we can change and tweak. So then unknowingly we're sending thousands of dollars to an invoice number that was manipulated through an interception in the cloud. There are many different ways that the cloud operates different threats, not necessarily equal to those that are on-prem, but shifting to a cloud model is something that we're seeing more businesses doing. Now, to answer the second part of that question, how do we know that other businesses are treating our data with care? Something that we get from clients is vendor assessments, questions from our clients asking how we deal with their data. What safeguards are we putting in place, and what vetting have we done to make sure that we're doing that responsibly? And I would say that's absolutely within your right to ask businesses how they're handling your data. And I would encourage you to. That's that piece of skepticism that we encourage to not just assume that the best is being done, but to ask those questions. So great question. Do we have any more on my list?
I was going to say I do, and I please, if you see more come up, let me know, because I cannot see them on my
Okay, I'll keep an eye on that.
This one says, I'm being encouraged to get business premium licensing for its security features. Is it worth it, and will it keep my business safe?
Depends on the features. So there are certainly some within Microsoft that they offer for business premium licensing that do give you access to really good security measures. Obviously, Microsoft, themselves being sort of the powerhouse of software, they have features built into their products that enable higher security for higher packages. And I would again say, look at NIST. See what they're offering, and does it fulfill one of those pillars that you're not already touching? I think, there is, with that layered argument of saying, yeah, you need another layer there, and another layer on top of that sort of adds to more money being spent, but not in the right places. So before you increase the premiums you're paying, the money that you're putting into those products, just take a realistic look at what it does. Talk to the All Mountain team and say, is this something that I need? Is it something that we're already fulfilling in another way, or is there a better use for it? It's certainly something to worth looking into. Now, when it comes to insurance, we're seeing those premiums go up, and those insurance companies are asking for additional steps that you need to put in place in order to get coverage. And those are really coming because they were hard hit. The way insurance works is they're sort of making a gamble. They're saying, we're gonna make a bet that you're not going to need to use this coverage, so this is the premium you'll have to pay to buy in. They really had a hard loss where they were paying out for insurance policies left and right. And because of that, they're now requiring harder, I would say more in-depth security measures in order to get those insurance policies. And those are really fall into our category of NIST too. The insurance companies are asking for them. Our government frameworks are suggesting that we do these things. And I think you're just going to see that as a general trend as the years follow. More security measures will be just required to do business. And we're seeing that also with federal regulations. For example, car dealerships. Right now, the FTC is requiring them to make massive lifts in their security posture in order to just stay open as a business. So I'd predict that is going to be a trend that we're going to see just continue to happen.
Okay, and the last one that I have on my end is just, what are the biggest cybersecurity threats right now?
That's right now. We would say, phishing attempts are definitely really high, but business email compromise is something that we saw from the beginning of this year up until about September increase astronomically. And that was far above ransomware attacks. Actually, we saw those take a dip. Now that's come back, but I'd say the biggest risk that we have at the moment is business email compromise. And that comes back to the cloud comment. We're putting a lot of data in the cloud. It's not just our email, it's the connected services, it's your SharePoint sites, it's your your OneDrives, those spaces where we store documents, we store information, we might even store personal data, records, credit card information, billing details. Those are interconnected resources and hubs of information, and they gain access via the cloud and via the email. So that is an attack vector that is definitely overexposed, and we're seeing that is being manipulated, because it's not necessarily about the ransom. It can be, but there's a lot of money and exchanges between businesses that occur in our emails, and that's definitely a space where they can jump in and steal money before you've even known it's exited your bank account. So email security, if you don't have MFA on your email, let's put that in place. It's a simple, good step to harden. Okay. I think that was our last question, Heather, wasn't it?
That's it.
That's it. Well, guys, thank you for joining. I hope this was useful, a little bit insightful. We will be we're recording this and sending it out, won't we, Heather?
We are.
So we can reference that as well. And we do have a few more sessions coming up. As I mentioned, we'll be looking into cloud security and having a more discussion on really the threats that exist there, tactics for defense, and how we can better our security posture there. And we'll also be doing a session on ransomware gangs and really diving into some specific case studies of gangs to really give you an outline of how they operate, and also just the fascinating world that exists in that space. So I encourage you to sign up for those too.
Well, thank everybody for coming and joining. And our next one, it's about cloud security, and it's December 7th. So we'll send out some more information and alerts, but we hope you come to the next one as well. But thank you.
Thank you, guys. Goodbye.
Bye.